So in this video, I'm going to be replying to a video that a popular Christian apologist on YouTube, InspiringPhilosophy, or Michael Jones, released a couple months ago called Top 10 Biblical Arguments Against Young Earth Creationism, or Top 10 Biblical Errors in Young Earth Creationism, something like that. And originally, I was going to make this one video that sort of replied to every individual argument one by one, but as I started doing that, I realized that it was just going to be a super long video, and nobody would probably watch it. So instead, I've decided to sort of break up the arguments into different videos, and I don't even know if I'm going to end up addressing all of them, just because I don't know if I'll have the time or energy to do that. But I'm going to be addressing at least the ones that I think are the most worthy of being addressed. Not because they're the most not because like some of his arguments are like that terrible, but rather because I think some of the arguments he made allow me to go more into detail about why I think creationism is true from a biblical perspective than some of the other questions. I just want to start this video by saying that I have no animosity towards Michael Jones. I'm sure he's a great guy. I'm sure he has the best of intentions with what he's trying to do. I don't think that he's someone who's intentionally trying to deceive people. I don't think that he's just this idiot. I think he's a very intelligent guy, and I think he listens to reason. And he has a lot of really good videos on his channel. I believe even on my own channel I have a playlist with his videos about the soul and its relationship to the brain and the mind and things like that. And he just has a lot of academic integrity. He has very good video quality production. He's a very good speaker. He has a lot of good things going for him. But recently, he's been on somewhat of a crusade against Young Earth Creationism from a biblical perspective. Most theistic evolutionists, when they're arguing against Young Earth Creationism, they'll just kind of pass over the biblical arguments, and they'll mostly focus on the scientific arguments. However, what I like about Inspiring Philosophy is that he really focuses on the biblical arguments, and he tries to get down into the details to show not only why the Bible is compatible with theistic evolution, but what Michael tries to do is he tries to show why the Bible is actually incompatible with young age creationism, which is a very unique and interesting perspective to take on it, at least for a popular apologist on YouTube. Obviously, in the academic world, it's a little bit different. But yeah, so I just want to start this video by saying that I have a lot of respect for Michael and what he does. And this video is solely for the purpose of expounding what I believe is the truth about Genesis 1, because the specific video I'm just going to be dealing with one of Michael's objections, and I believe this is this is a little weird because Michael goes backwards from 10 to 1, but as I was counting them, I was going forward. So this is the 6th objection that Michael makes in his video, so I believe that would be number 4, if my math is correct about that. Sorry, I don't know. But basically, the objection I'm going to be addressing in this video is one that Michael makes towards the end of his video, which is that the creation account in Genesis 1 is not actually about the literal material creation of the world ex nihilo. And I apologize if I'm misrepresenting this argument, but this is, as I understand the argument, what he's saying. Rather, what Michael argues in his video is that Genesis 1 is actually talking about the assignment of function to the world. So the imposition of order upon the world. This is an idea that is supported by a lot of liberal scholars, you could call them, people like, John Walton, and some others whose names I can't quite remember. But John Walton, in his book, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, goes into detail explaining this perspective that Genesis 1 is about the assignment of function to the world and not the literal material creation of it. And in his video, as a proof for this, Michael cites Jeremiah chapter 4. Now, in Jeremiah chapter 4, I believe, let me just pull it up here, I believe that this is verses 23 to 24, Prophet Jeremiah is describing the destruction of the northern kingdom, right? So he says, I looked on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void, and to the heavens they had no light. And then he goes through it, and basically the point is that throughout Jeremiah's description of the destruction of the northern kingdom, he alludes heavily to the creation week. And the point that Michael draws out of this is that Prophet Jeremiah is not talking about, the undoing of the northern kingdom. He's not talking about its literal evisceration off the face of the earth. Rather, he's talking about the northern kingdom falling into more and more dysfunction, right? And so then Michael extrapolates from this that, well, if Prophet Jeremiah is using the creation week motif to describe growing dysfunction in the northern kingdom, then this must mean that he understood the creation week itself to be about God's assignment of function to the world and not his literal creation of it. Now, I really like this argument, and that's because I really agree with the principle that underlies it, right? So the principle that Michael is using here, or I guess hermeneutic, maybe you could call it, is that if we want to understand what Genesis 1 is talking about, then we should look to see how later biblical authors, or later biblical books, just generally, use the creation week motif. And so we should use later scriptural accounts of the creation week, however they show up, right? Here, Prophet Jeremiah does not just cite Genesis 1 as like some sort of prophecy of, the northern kingdom's destruction. Rather, he's using, allusion, imagery, right? This is the majority of the time when later biblical authors allude to earlier portions of the Bible, they don't just explicitly quote it. Sometimes they do, but most of the time it's this exact method. They use imagery, allusion, and so on. That's exactly what Prophet Jeremiah is doing here. He is using the imagery from Genesis 1 to call our minds back to it, but he's also offering an interpretation of Genesis 1. And so Michael correctly identifies that if we want to understand Genesis 1, we should see how the later biblical authors interpret it and use that as our hermeneutic for understanding the text of Genesis 1 itself. And I'm not even going to contest that Jeremiah 4 is about the growing dysfunction of the northern kingdom, even though I think I could probably make an argument that it's actually about the destruction of the northern kingdom, that you could say, well, if it's about the destruction of the northern kingdom, what's the opposite of destruction? It's creation. But I'm not even going to use that point. Instead, I'll totally concede to Michael's point that Jeremiah 4 is solely about, the growing dysfunction in the northern kingdom, and therefore Prophet Jeremiah's interpretation of Genesis 1 in this specific context is about the fact that Genesis 1 was about God's assignment of order to the creation. Now, the problem with this argument comes about when we apply this principle that Michael himself has agreed to in making this argument, when we apply this principle consistently across the Bible. And this is because the creation week motif shows up everywhere in Scripture. It's literally all over the place. And so there are many places in Scripture we can go to that allow us to use the same hermeneutical principle to interpret Genesis 1. And the problem for Michael is that when we do this, we see that Genesis 1 cannot be read as anything other than a material creation account. Now, how can I say that so confidently? Well, there are many examples I could point to, but the primary one I want to draw our attention to is the creation of the temple and the tabernacle. Okay, so it's well known among biblical scholars that Michael himself is probably familiar with. I believe even John Walton talks about this. I know Brant Petrie talks about this, N.T. Wright, John Bergsma, people who are in that sort of world. They talk about the fact that Genesis 1 through 2 describes the creation as God's temple, right? So God creates the world, and it is the temple in which God is going to dwell. This is why throughout the Bible, the world is described, or the earth is described as having a foundation, pillars, and four corners, right? This is not imagery to describe a flat disk. Rather, this is imagery used to describe a house. And this is because the earth, the creation, is the house of God, right, in which he is to dwell with his people. This is why the book of Revelation ends, where the entire world, the entire cosmos, is transfigured into the temple of God as it was meant to be in the beginning. So this really isn't a contested point. However, the problem comes about for Michael when we get into the details of how the temple and tabernacle are described. So when it comes to the temple, we see that in 1 Kings chapter 6, we're told that the temple was built in 7 years, right? So this is a clear allusion to the fact that the world was created in 7 days, right? God creates the world in 6 days. He rests on the 7th, just as Solomon's temple was created in 7 years. However, if Genesis 1 was just about the assignment of function to the world, it wouldn't make sense why 1 Kings 6 would use the creation week motif to talk about the creation of the temple, right? It's not as if the temple already existed, and then over the course of 7 years, the Israelites were assigning functions to it. No, it was in the course of 7 years, the Israelites were literally building the temple. And so using Michael's own hermeneutical principle here, that if we want to understand Genesis 1, we should look at how later biblical authors interpret it, we can come to the conclusion that just as 1 Kings 6 describes the creation of the temple in 7 years, so also does Genesis 1 describe the creation of the world, the creation, in 7 days. And if you think that that's just a coincidence, that it just so happens that the temple, the house of God, happened to be built in 7 years, just as the world, which is also the house of God, was built in 7 days, then consider the account of the tabernacle's creation. Now, the tabernacle's creation account is sort of broken up into 2 sections. So first you have Exodus 25 through 31, and this is where God is giving Moses the instructions for how the Israelites are to build the tabernacle. And now it's very clear throughout these instructions that the creation week is at play. And this is because the phrase, "Then the Lord said to Moses," appears 7 times throughout God's instructions. Namely, it appears in chapter 25, verse 1, chapter 30, verse 11, 30:17, 30:22, 30:34, 31:1, and then finally in 31:12. And now I want to focus on that last one, because maybe you think that this is all just a coincidence. You know, the temple's built in 7 years, the tabernacle's instructions are given in 7 speeches. Maybe that's just a coincidence. Well, allow me to put that to rest, because in Exodus 31, verses 12 through 17, which is the 7th time, like I said, that God speaks to Moses in the instructions for the tabernacle, what's it about? It's about the 7th day of creation. It's about the Sabbath. And it is in this very context that God says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed." And he uses this as an explanation for why the Israelites also are to work for 6 days and rest on the 7th. It's in this very context that this phrase shows up. And the implication seems very obvious. It means that the Israelites are going to be doing the same things that God did during the creation week, right? Because this is happening right before the Israelites are actually about to build the tabernacle, right? And so this tells us beyond any shadow of a doubt that just as God literally created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, so also are the Israelites literally going to create the tabernacle following God's series of 7 instructions. Okay, and this is confirmed when we get to the place in Exodus where the tabernacle is actually fully built and it's completed. And what do we see? In Exodus 39 and 40, it says, "Moses saw all their work, and behold, just as the Lord had commanded it, they had done it, and he blessed them." Moses completed the work. This is language taken straight from Genesis 1, where after the creation week, God saw all that he has made, and behold, it was very good. The heavens and the earth were completed, and God completed on the 7th day the work that he had done. Right? So this is the same exact Hebrew words being used in Exodus 39 and 40 to describe the completion of the tabernacle that were used in Genesis 1 to describe God's completion of the world. So, this tells us, once again, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that if the account of the tabernacle's creation in Exodus 25 through 40 is about the material creation of the tabernacle, and it's invoking the creation week using Michael's own hermeneutical principle, this has to mean that Genesis 1 is about the material creation of the world. And in fact, it goes a step further than this, because Michael, along with lots of liberal scholars nowadays, deny the fact that Genesis 1 is actually about creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. However, Exodus 31 absolutely refutes this, because in the first speech of God to Moses on how to build the tabernacle, what does he say? It says that the Israelites have to gather up all of the raw materials that they will then use to turn into the tabernacle itself, right? Into the dwelling place of God. And so this tells us beyond any shadow of doubt that because this corresponds to the first day of creation, because once again, it's the first time that God says, then the Lord said, or that the text says, then the Lord said to Moses, this means that when Genesis 1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, this means that God was creating all of the raw materials that he would then use to turn into the world in which he would dwell. And this is why Exodus 25 that said that. And Exodus 25 ends, after God tells the Israelites that they have to gather up all these raw materials, he says, and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Right? And this is exactly what God was doing during the creation week. He was making a sanctuary ex nihilo, in which he would dwell among his people. And so that essentially is my argument. And the only thing I'll really add to this is that this is how Genesis 1 has traditionally been interpreted. I mean, to be quite frank, there is not a single interpreter, either Christian or Jewish, in the past 2,000 years that I'm aware of at least, who read Genesis 1 as anything other than a literal creation account. Obviously you had people who tried to sort of allegorize it away, but even they recognized that Genesis 1 was not about the assignment of function to the world, but that, at face value, it was about the creation of the world. Right? We see this in Second Temple literature, such as the second book of the Maccabees, chapter 7, right, where there's the invocation of the heavens and the earth, and it says that God made them out of nothing. Right, and this is explicit in the writings of the early church fathers, such as Saint Hippolytus of Rome, who says, on the first day God made what he made out of nothing, but on the other days he did not make out of nothing, but out of what he had made on the first day by molding it according to his pleasure. And then St. Augustine also picks this up by saying that the earth itself and every earthly material is absolutely created out of nothing. And this sort of sets the stage for all later Christian interpretation of Genesis 1. And so, although to the secular reader, or listener, I guess, this doesn't really make that much of a difference, the fact that Christians have always interpreted Genesis 1, at the very least, as a creation account, and if not more than that, as a creation ex nihilo account, it should make any Christian uncomfortable that Christians, for thousands of years, have been misreading the very foundation of the Scriptures, when Christ promised that he would lead his church into all truth. Why would he let his church fall into error on this very important question for so many years, only to have it be discovered by liberal scholars in the 20th and 21st centuries? It just doesn't make sense from a narratival perspective. And that is the primary reason why I do not agree with Michael's interpretation of Genesis 1, mostly just because if it's true, then Christianity might as well be false, because our Lord was a liar when he said he would lead the church into all truth. So with that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.